Chapter 25 of From Different Standpoints by Pansy and Faye Huntington. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25 Eleanor to her Mother. February blank. This is our wedding anniversary, as you may remember, though in that case you were more thoughtful than anyone in this vicinity. Indeed, people here have time for only one thought, and the topic which is so all-engrossing is, of course, Eunice Taylor. No other person has power to move the sluggish pulse of this quiet town. Miss Taylor is sick, has been for weeks, and it is almost amusing to see the interest which centers in that sick room. Every hour in the day we have bulletins telling of the patient's state, and as these do not vary greatly in their report, they cease to be of special interest. Seriously, I suppose the girl is quite ill, and I am not so much of a barbarian as to want to have her suffer. But I can't help thinking that some good may grow out of this confinement. If she were well, we should have Tom dawdling about, and now I hope that he will get over his fancy before she gets well. And there is likely to be plenty of time, for the physician says she will not recover very speedily. And now I suppose it is true that her sickness is the result of her too close attentions upon Mother Harrison. They ought to have known better than to let a young girl take such a responsible position. But some people will do almost anything and run almost any risk of health and life for money. As usual, my husband is very kind, doing everything that can be done for the Taylors, and it is no more than right that he should. I understand how he feels, for she was a faithful attendant, and did more for Mother Harrison than any stranger would have done, and of course he feels he owes her a debt of gratitude. If money could pay such debts, dear me, I wish it could, she would have been paid 100 times over. I am glad that I have not such a grateful disposition. I should not like to be forever in one's debt. But so long as Perry feels that way, he will have to go on paying in installments. Well, as I said, this is our anniversary. Perry has not spoken of it, and I will not remind him of the fact, so I presume we shall spend the day like all other days. What a year this has been! I wonder if all the years to come will be like it. I never expected to settle down into this humdrum sort of life. It might suit some women, but it is not to my taste. I suppose that Eunice Taylor would have considered it the height of bliss to have lived in this aristocratic old house, and taken up the work which one might find to do here. On the whole, I don't know but it was a mistake that Perry did not marry her. I know she thinks so, and I know, too, that he has thought so, but of late he seems changed. If it were not for his conscience, we should get on splendidly. It used to be his health, but he has outgrown that. I believe he would risk his life for me. He seems to have forgotten that he ought to be careful. Actually, I have to be careful for him. But that conscience of his is a most inconvenient article to have about one. As for managing that, I have given up in despair. It is altogether beyond me. But, Mamma, it is not a very pleasant thought for any woman that her husband in his utmost heart has felt that another should have had the place he has given her. And, though I believe that he is trying to put that other out of his heart and out of his thoughts, sometimes I just hate them both. And this is the worst of all, that he should have forgotten what day this is. You know that I never was sentimental over birthdays and all that, but I believe in a proper notice of the first anniversary of one's marriage, if only for the looks of it. Well, I am going to ride, so goodbye until after dinner. Later. Well, Mamma, I shall have to take it back. Dear me, I wonder if I shall have to take more things back. I went to drive, as I said, drove over to see Miss Wilbur, and came around by the river road so that it was past dinner hour when I reached home. Found Perry waiting in the dining room. I am sorry you have been kept waiting, I said, just as coldly as I could speak, for I had been nursing my indignation all the morning. It is of no consequence, he said. I have only just come in. I ran upstairs, not because I cared about keeping him waiting, but because my drive had given me an appetite. But I did not come down quite as soon as I intended. On my dressing table lay a package addressed "To my wife," with 2 dates, one a year ago and the other today. He had not forgotten after all. And that was why he sent Thomas into the city last night and again this morning. Then I had to dress for dinner. My driving costume would not do at all with such jewels as that box held. I just wonder what the man did with his conscience when he spent such a sum for diamonds for his wife. And, Mamma, I have not seen such a look on his face for 6 months as he wore when I came down to dinner with them on. Now, don't imagine that we rehearsed a scene. Nothing of the kind. We are not of that sort. He said simply, "How do you like them?" And I replied, "They are magnificent, thank you." And then we ate our dinner. I suppose it would have been proper to have sentimentalized somewhat over the day we celebrate, but we are neither of us hypocrites enough for that. He wanted to please me, and I was pleased, and that is all there is about it. And while I am so comfortable about Tom, I can not help being happy. I am sure I have all I wanted when I married Perry Harrison. I never pretended to have married for love. I wanted the name and position which he had to give, and if he chose to fancy that his love with it was something to set that off, why, I never disputed him. This congratulatory mood in regard to her brother continued until that March day when she was surprised by his reappearance in Nassau. She sat moodily looking over the last magazine when he returned from his call upon Una. She had been roused to a pitch of fury by seeing him turn his steps in that direction an hour before, and had scolded Perry as if he were to blame, and finally driven him off to his room, where he paced the floor, not fighting the old battle over. In that old struggle he had so far won the victory that he had ceased, even in his secret heart, to think of the past as a mistake, and to mourn over it. All the ruins of the past were but a foundation upon which to build anew, and the earnest, wrestling prayers of the present were for his wife. Daily he submitted himself before the Lord that his faith might rise to take hold of that infinite love which he longed to have encircle her. It seemed to him that morning that she was farther than ever away from God and from him. Seldom had she been so bitter and sarcastic in her remarks. Never had his patience been more tried. Never had he come so near utter despair. And, with her taunting and even insulting remarks ringing in his ears, he could only take his position squarely upon the promises, and, resting in the certainty of their fulfillment, wait God's own time, which was nearer than he in his most exalted moments dared to hope. Eleanor's mood was not improved by what she was able to draw from Tom as he passed through the sitting-room. "Well," she said, "so you have come back. I began to think that you were going to spend the day. Did you and Miss Taylor settle the destiny of nations?" "Not exactly," he replied. "We were only interested in individual destinies." He was passing through to the next room, but she recalled him. "Tom, it is no secret, but you may not be aware that Eunice Taylor was, and is yet for aught I know, in love with my husband, and that her illness is in a great measure owing to her disappointment. Of course, it is just as well to put it that she was all worn out from the cares of last summer, but we all understand it. Now, if you want to marry her, you may. I have told you the truth. I presume, however, it will be all the same to you. I don't pretend to understand the code of morals which you and Perry and some other people have adopted." "Thank you," said Tom, his face flushing, then paling. "Your warning comes too late. I do not need any information as to Miss Taylor's past history. And please to understand, Eleanor, that disparaging or insulting remarks about her will be considered as personal. And another thing, do, I beg of you, take care how you speak lightly of your husband's character, even to your brother." And he went out, leaving Eleanor angry and ashamed. For once she was thoroughly ashamed. She suddenly realized that it was no light thing to speak thus of her husband, and however much he might endure from her, spoken to him, it was a different matter when she cast suspicion on him by talking to another. She knew Tom would not tell him, but what if he had overheard? Some way, all her plans, and all her hopes as well, seemed slipping away from her. Tom would marry Eunice Taylor. That was evidently a settled matter, in his own mind at least. They were all linked together against her. Some way she felt shut out. Tom was positively cruel to her. She could not see why he need be so cross. He had not been at all as he used to be since Eunice Taylor went to New York. Of course she had prejudiced him against her. It was a hard, bitter lot. But sometime she would have her revenge out of it. Tossing her book away, she went upstairs, reappearing an hour later in all the magnificence of her last new toilette. "Perry," she said at his door, "I am going to the city on the train. If you choose to drive in for me this evening, you will find me at Mrs. Clark's. Otherwise I will come back at 9 o'clock." "Why, isn't this a sudden start?" "Somewhat. But what do you think? Will you come for me?" "Certainly, unless something occurs to prevent. I will be there at 7 o'clock. Good bye." He looked after her with a longing, wistful expression which did not escape Tom's eyes as he stood by listening to the conversation. "Unceremonious, I declare," he said, laughing, "when I have only a couple of days to stay." Perry looked grave as he turned to resume the conversation which had been broken off. He, at least, was enjoying his brother-in-law's visit. They dined together, and then went out to walk and talk, and so passed the afternoon. Meantime, Eleanor was trying to get away from herself, though she did not know that. She walked rapidly down the hill to the depot, and found herself too early by 15 minutes. It was not a pleasant place in which to wait, that dingy little sitting room, but there seemed nothing better to do, so she seated herself on one of the benches, gathering her flounced train up out of the dust, and prepared to endure the discomfort of the next quarter of an hour. Two girls were walking about the room, with the unrest of girlhood, eagerly picking up items which might interest them for the moment. On a table in one corner was a quantity of papers and tracts. And Eleanor remembered just then that she had heard Perry and Eunice discussing the propriety of that arrangement, and she had laughed at the idea and said that it was like all the rest of their plans, pretty enough to talk about, but of no practical value. People who wanted that sort of reading would supply themselves, and others would not be caught by that bait. In their progress around the room, the young girls came to this table, and, leaning over, began reading snatches from the papers. Eleanor paid little attention to them. Indeed, she was not conscious of listening at all, nor did she know until afterward a single word that they said. But when she was seated in the car, these words flashed upon her. She had heard them time and again, but never did they come to her just as they did in that hour. And years afterward she could hear that fresh, young voice repeating, "Thou art tried in the balances, and art found wanting." With a startling emphasis they came to her, as if spoken by an invisible voice. There was a whole sermon in the words, and never in her life had she been so affected by any sermon. Tried in the balances! Suddenly all her past life seemed thrown into the descending scale, which sunk lower and lower, and alas, she had nothing with which to balance it. Found wanting! The words rung in her ears until it seemed as if they were borne on the wind. She had been censuring others while her own life was an utter blank. Wanting! Overwhelmed by the thoughts which flooded her brain, she was half a mind to take the up train and go back home from the first station. But, finally considering that she was nervous, decided to go on. "I declare," she said, "I stay cooped up so much that even this little trip has all unnerved me. I shall be unfitted for going out at all at this rate." Reaching the city, she first tried shopping as a remedy for her low spirits, but someway silks and velvets had lost their attractions. Laces were only a vexatious puzzle. And, after making a few purchases, she sought out her friend, Mrs. Clark, hoping that in her cheery home she would be brightened up. As she waited a few moments for that lady's appearance, she said to herself, "My heart is as heavy as lead. I don't see what is the matter with me. I never was so troubled by anything as I am by that verse, and I have heard it 1,000 times. Dear me, I wish I could forget it." Mrs. Clark was full of chatter about the things which usually interested Eleanor, but today she could not get rid of the weight which rested upon her heart. Presently callers came. One lady was on her way to a religious meeting and full of eager interest in it. "You ought to go to the meetings," she said to Mrs. Clark. "They are wonderful. I never heard such preaching. Yesterday afternoon the text was, 'Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye may say, Wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings.' And in the evening it was, 'Thou art tried, and art found wanting.'" Eleanor started as if she had received an electric shock. Those words again! How they followed her! The lady went on. "You know Mrs. Gage. She has been a church member for years, but this morning she came into the meeting and said that she had been led to look into her heart and life, and she saw that, tried by the word of God, she was found wanting, and it was now her purpose to give herself anew to Christ in a full consecration." As the talk went on, Eleanor felt as if she must stop her ears. It was distracting to her. She could not think connectedly, and she wondered how she was to get through the afternoon. And when her husband drove to the door an hour earlier than the appointed hour, full of apologies for coming so early and explaining that there was likely to be a heavy storm, she met him with exclamations of delight, and would not listen to their hostess's urgent invitations to wait for an early tea. "No," she whispered to Perry, "I want to get home." "Haven't you had a pleasant time?" he asked as they rode away. "No, it was just horrid." Her tone was so strange that Perry asked anxiously, "Are you ill?" "Thank you, I am perfectly well, but I think I am stupid. I guess I got chilled going down," she replied. "Your brother and I have had a good visit," said Perry. "I tell you, Eleanor, Tom is a wonderful Christian." "Well," she replied almost petulantly, "it is well to have one in the family. None of the rest of us make any pretensions to being remarkable in that line. For my part, I never saw the need of making a fuss over one's religion. Mine is good enough for me." "Oh, Eleanor!" That was all he said in reply to her, but there was a world of tender yearning in the tone, and Eleanor felt it. And here was another thing that she could not get away from. That was just the beginning of a fierce conflict in Eleanor Harrison's soul. Oh, the restless, weary tossings of days and nights that followed! Days and nights within which there was no rest, no light. Found wanting! Why, her life had been one continual nothingness. She had absolutely nothing to put against the folly and dissipations of her life, her envyings and hatreds, and all the rest of the long array of sins which all at once stood out in all their ugliness. Of the fruits of the Spirit, what had she wherewith to prove her right to the Christian name she bore? She had been so secure in her religious profession, and now thus suddenly to find it turning into a shrunken and lifeless thing, with no weight, and to have nothing to put in its place, plunged her into despair. Turn which way she would, she saw only condemnation written. She could find no rest for her weary soul. In vain she tried to occupy middle ground. She could not bring herself to a full personal consecration. To her mind that involved so much that was impossible, and she tried to make compromises with her soul. She would be more patient and gentle. She began to realize how utterly selfish she was, How unwilling she was to make sacrifices for others, while demanding of them constant yielding to her wishes, and she resolved to begin a life of unselfish devotion to others, her husband first, and then she would extend her loving ministrations to those around her. But in vain. She could not rid herself of the ringing sound of that word which followed her and thrust itself in and spoiled everything she undertook. What was the use of doing anything if always there be something wanting? What should be put in the balance? It was one morning at prayers that it came to her in 2 words which Perry read. She did not remember the connection at all. Her ear caught the expression, and suddenly it all rushed upon her that here was what she needed — Christ's righteousness. With this to throw into the balance she would never be tried with that miserable result, found wanting. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of From Different Standpoints by Pansy and Faye Huntington. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. A shadow darkened the doorway of the neat little back parlor where Eunice Taylor sat, sufficiently recovered now to trifle with a bit of sewing, or read a little, or take short walks around the room, as her fancy might please. She glanced up, expecting to see her mother, or perhaps Aunt Katy, a kind old friend near at hand, who had been by turns nurse and watcher and cook, and all the time a faithful friend during the long illness. "Why, good afternoon," she said slowly, an accent of surprise as well as of doubt how to receive her caller showing in her tones, for it was Mrs. Perry Harrison, in faultless afternoon toilette, standing before her. "Come in, please," and she half arose, as if she would give her visitor a seat. "Oh, don't get up," Eleanor said, gliding into the room and coming close to the crimson chair. "How ill you look! No, I mean how well, compared with what one might have expected after such a long sickness. They told me you were greatly changed. How long is it since that afternoon when I saw you last? Does it seem very long to you? Oh, dear!" To what did the exclamation apply? And what had occurred to make Mrs. Harrison nervous? Positively, this was the first time that Eunice had seen her since the day before she was taken sick. Among all the callers who had penetrated to her sick room since she began to grow better, and among all the less intimate friends who had called since she came downstairs, Mrs. Harrison had not been counted. For the sake of the public, and the desire she had to have Perry's relations with his wife appear well before that public, Eunice had been sorry. For herself, she rejoiced. In her weakened state she had dreaded meeting her persistent foe. Her cheeks grew red, and she felt nervous over meeting her this afternoon. Why had she come? Some unpleasant errand must have brought her. It did not appear for some time why she had come. She was strangely silent, lapsing into long pauses, when her face, from the grave, troubled expression that rested on it, was a study. Eunice watched her with a puzzled air, the nervousness gradually passing off. Mrs. Harrison was somehow, somewhere changed. What was it? Nothing definable, nothing tangible, a subtle, mysterious, positive something. Breaking a longer silence than usual, which had followed an attempt to be civil and commonplace in her inquiries and expressions of sympathy, Mrs. Harrison said, suddenly, "Eunice, suppose you wanted to begin life all over again, just as if you hadn't lived it at all, or wanted to forget that you had, how would you begin?" What a strange question. "Why," said Eunice, hesitating and laughing a little, "I think I would just begin. I might not be able to forget, you know, but I would play that I did, and go ahead, doing the best that I could." To herself she said, "I surely ought to be able to give advice on that point. Don't I want to begin at the beginning and forget everything? I wonder what it is that she wants to forget." "But I mean," said Mrs. Harrison, and her fair face flushed a deep red, suppose one's life had been a deception from beginning to end. Suppose one had deceived one's self first, in a measure, well, yes, largely, and then had deceived others more, one's very best friend, you know, and, indeed, everybody. And suppose one were dreadfully, awfully sick of the life of deception and sin, where would one commence?" "Mrs. Harrison," said Una, laying down the bit of needlework she had been holding, and turning astonished eyes on her guest, "what can you mean?" "I mean more than you can possibly imagine, and I don't know why I am telling you, except that it seems to me I must tell somebody. Eunice Taylor, you think you know me, and you think I am only a cold, selfish woman without any heart or conscience. I am a good deal more than that. I've choked my heart and stifled my conscience, and my worst enemy need not have wished me a more miserable life than the one I have been leading. Now I want help. It seemed to me as though perhaps you could give it, and I have come to ask you. Once, away back, ever so many years ago, I believed I was converted. For a little while I kept up the farce of being religious, or what passed for the name. But finally I came to believe that there was nothing to it but name, that I had as much as anybody else, and the people who pretended to have more were hypocrites or fanatics. My mother was a church member, and that, among other things, confirmed me in my views. Well, I wouldn't, if I could, go back and tell you about all my miserable life. It would make you sick again. Yet I have resolved to tell you this afternoon some things that I never meant to tell to anybody, in order that you may help me. Once I was engaged to a man whom I respected and loved. He lost his money through what seemed to me a piece of folly born of religious fanaticism. He called it common honesty. We quarreled and separated. That is a long story, but I put it briefly because I do not like to talk about it. After that I became engaged to Perry Harrison. I never loved him. I respected him, and his money, and his old name, and his education, and all that sort of thing, and I didn't believe I was doing anything so very wicked, for I thought I could make him happy enough. He was a gay young man when I knew him first, and would have been satisfied with a gay life such as I was willing to lead with him. But it all turned out so utterly different from anything that I had planned. You know what sort of man he became, but you don't know how nearly I have come to hating him for it, nor what an awful life I have lived. Not realizing either that the awfulness was of my making. I didn't love my husband, but I resented his not loving me, and I believed myself an ill-used creature who had a right to get what she could out of a wicked life. But I haven't been able to get anything out of it but utter misery. I believe I have been nearer suicide than many a one who reaches that depth at last. Now, Eunice Taylor, why am I telling you all this? I have as nearly hated you as it is possible for a sane woman to hate another woman. And yet, you see, I am coming to you for help. Don't speak yet. I have more to say. I have had an experience, lately, different from anything else in life. I have found that I never was a Christian. That there is Christianity. That there is a Savior, and that he can and has both saved and forgiven me. "Thank God," said Eunice in a low, awe-stricken tone. "Thank you for that," Mrs. Harrison said. "It makes me feel that I have come to the right source for help. I believe in my soul that God sent me to you. I did not mean to tell you all the miserable story that I have been pouring out. I meant to have been utterly silent about some portions of it. But I have grown so awfully sick of deception in all its forms that there are times when it seems to me it would be a relief to cry the whole story out to a gaping world. Now I am coming to the place where I want your help. How much of this miserable story ought I to tell my husband? I need not tell you that I have learned to respect him as few men can be respected, and I need not assure you that I mean to try with all my soul to repair some of the misery of the past. But will it repair it, to go over those sickening details, 100 times more sickening than you can imagine, and make clear to him where I have stood?" For the first time since her excited story began, she paused, and waited eagerly, one might almost say hungrily, for Eunice's reply. What could she say to her? "You ask me such a sudden and such a solemn question," she said at last, "that I ought not to answer you hastily. I don't know what to say or to think. You have overwhelmed me." "I know. You are sick, and I ought not to have come. But I couldn't help it. I'll tell you one other thing, and then the depths of my degradation will have been reached. That man, the one with whom I quarreled, and whom I sent away from me, has always been, and is to-day, the one man who is more to me than any one on earth, and, up to 3 days ago, I could have said than any one in heaven. I have tried to hate him. I have struggled hard. I believe I have succeeded in acting to him as though I did hate him. But, well, I haven't, and it is impossible. Now, is it ever going to be possible to get away from this feeling? And is this a thing that, in order to be true, I must confess to my husband?" Now Eunice began to have a glimmer of the way she had been led, and the reason why. Was it that she might help this struggling, tempted soul? Why not? But, in order to help her, she must be as frank as herself. Could she be? If she couldn't, what had the Lord Jesus a right to think of the prayers she had offered for that soul? Her hesitation was brief. "Eleanor," she said, leaning forward and laying her hand on Mrs. Harrison's arm, and addressing her by a name that she rarely used, "you have reached ground now where I can indeed help you. What one has experienced oneself, one can know to be true. You can conquer that feeling. God both can and will help you. He is faithful who promised, and will not suffer you to be tempted above what you are able to bear. He can take away the love you ought not to feel. He can give you rest of soul just where it ought to rest. Eleanor Harrison, I know, for I have been down to the very depths of that degradation of which you speak, lower down, perhaps, than you have been. I know what I am talking about, and I know He who made the heart can hold its loves and its hates in His hand. I wonder if you understand me? Remember, I say, I know it to be true." "I understand," said Mrs. Harrison, speaking in a low tone of suppressed excitement. "I understand you fully. I thank you, and I thank God for your words. They help me as no other words could." "As for the other question," said Eunice, strangely calmed now, the very force of her effort to say that which cost her pride so dear, seemed to have hushed the tumult in her heart. "I must think of that. I may be wrong, utterly wrong. But it seems to me now that it can do no possible good to lead your husband through all the misery of such revelations. He has had enough to bear. Surely you might spare him where you could. No, I would begin right here, it seems to me. Eleanor, he knows enough. Why, you have shown him in 1,000 ways that you do not love him. If you can begin to show him that you respect him, it will be dearer to him now than anything else can be. And I feel sure that the respect that you can bestow, and that, as a Christian, you will grow to feel for him, will be a truer basis than that of mere human, unhallowed love. Now, as I said, this may be wrong advice. I cannot tell. I am startled and almost frightened by your story, and yet I pity you as I could not have pitied you but for some things that I have felt. And I will help you. Oh, how I will help you! I feel now as if I could." "You have told me the truth," Mrs. Harrison said, rising and drawing her wraps around her, "and that in itself has helped me. I was almost forced to come to you. I don't know what I shall do or where I shall commence, but I know I must commence a different life with my husband. He has borne a great deal. I'll make what amends I can." She came over close to Eunice's chair and touched her arm with a gentle, caressing sort of movement. Another woman of different mold would have bent and kissed the girl. Mrs. Harrison only stood close beside her. "Una," she said at last, using the name she had almost never used, "you have had a great deal to bear from me. I believe you are great enough to forgive me. Can you let me be your sister, I wonder?" There were tears in Una's eyes, and she could not trust her voice to make any answer. But she did what she had not supposed it possible to do to Mrs. Perry Harrison. She raised herself to a level with the fair, haughty face, and left a tender kiss on her cheek. It was long since she had written in her journal, not, indeed, since her sickness. I think she felt satisfaction in writing in it occasionally, because it merely received the revelations that she made from time to time, without regard to the strange changes of opinion which she chronicled, and without demanding wearisome explanations as to how she reached that state of feeling. So she wrote just what she wanted to express, utterly unintelligible though it must have been, viewed from the journal's standpoint. April, 18 —. Poor Eleanor Harrison! What a fierce, undisciplined heart she has! What struggles she will have to make! What struggles she has made to crush her better self! What an infinite compassion to wait for her, and call after her, and receive her at last as his child, even though she had professed to bear his name, and was a false witness for him all the time! What a Saviour! Truly no human heart will dare to stand aloof and unforgiving after that. I will help her. I feel sure that I can. Don't I know something of the struggle? Don't I know the heights of grace that our Lord is willing to bestow? What strange leadings! Fierce lives! We need none of us have had them, if we had been willing to be led instead of insisting on leading ourselves. And yet the Lord would not let us make shipwreck. He will save us all. He will give us work, I verily believe, to do for him. He will even crown us each with jewels at the last. What wonderful forgiveness! Surely there is no sin that a child of his ought not to learn to forgive in another. She asked me if I could be her sister. I had to do it. It was an awful humiliation, but for the sake of her soul's peril I had to do it. I had to be entirely frank. I believe it helped her. Yes, I will be her sister. Perry, my brother, I will be your wife's faithful, patient, helpful, forgiving sister. So help me God. More writing. Eleanor wrote a letter that night to her mother. Perry waited for her in their dressing room, and watched the swift pen move gracefully over the paper, and marked the flush on her cheek, and wondered, with a heavy sigh, what she could be writing, and whether it was another letter that ought to blush to see the light of day. Thus ran the letter: Dear Mama, I want you to do something for me. I want you to gather every letter that I have ever written to you since I was married, every scrap, and burn them all. Do it just as soon as you get this letter. I want you to burn every single word, and I wish I could in some way burn the remembrance of them from your heart. Mama, a great deal of what I have written you is false. Indeed, almost everything I ever wrote you or told you, I believe has been false. I am a living lie. I have been, but oh, well, Mama, I do not know how to tell you anything about it, for I feel sure that you would not understand. You are a member of the church, just as I have been, but still I know that you will not understand the change in me. I can not tell you about it, but it does seem to me that I can live it. I would give all the money I am worth in the world if I had not written you those letters. I have insulted my husband, and he is grand enough for me almost to fall down and worship him instead. And some of the very times I was writing to you I felt that he was. Mama, he is waiting for me now while I am writing, and it makes me nervous. I will break right off here. Perhaps next time I can write more coherently. Only, Mama, be sure you do just as I say. Tom, said Mrs. Haddington to her son, as he dropped in one morning to receive her commands, "I really think you ought to go down to Nassau and look after Eleanor. I believe she is losing her mind. I received the most utterly incoherent letter from her last night that you ever heard of. She says I will not understand her, and I am sure I don't. Just read it and see what you think." It was a very reluctant hand that reached out to receive the letter. At first Tom Haddington was tempted to say that he would not read it. He had tolerated enough of his sister's letters. But, on second thought, it seemed necessary to be prepared for anything she might do. So he held the dainty perfumed note in disdainful fingers and read. But when he handed it back there was a light in his eyes and a ring in his voice that made his mother wonder. "Instead of losing her mind, mother, I should say that she was at last coming into the possession of her sense, clothed and in her right mind. The God of miracles still lives." "I believe you are all of you insane together, and I wish I knew what to do with you." Thus muttered his mother, as her son turned, with apparently a new-born, eager purpose, and hastily left the room. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of From Different Standpoints by Pansy and Faye Huntington. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. It was a strange, sad comment upon the relations existing between this husband and wife, that Eleanor could go to Eunice Taylor, whom she had so hated, and could write to her mother, whose Christian life she felt had little depth. She could speak to these two of the change which had come to her, yet she could not summon courage to tell Perry of this new experience. Twice during the day following her interview with Una, her hand was upon the knob of the library door, but even then she turned back. She had an intense longing to make amends for all the wrongdoing of the past. She longed for his forgiveness. She felt that she could go down on her knees to him and beg him to forgive her for all the fearful wrongs she had done him. But she knew that he would scarcely understand the depth of her sorrow unless he knew all. "He would not hate me quite, even if he knew everything," she said to herself, "and God knows I have no wish to deceive anyone. And yet, as Una said, he has suffered enough already, and I may spare him now. But how shall I prove to him that I am trying to begin all over? Will he not think it all another piece of acting? If he really knew me as I have been, he might well think so." It was positively a sacrifice for Eleanor not to lay open to her husband's gaze the horrible black gulf of sin and falsehood and deception through which she had dragged, and from which she had been lifted by the surpassing love of an infinite Saviour. She had such a desire to have all clear between herself and Perry, and such a longing for help and sympathy, that it was hard to be silent. It was a sacrifice to save, not her own feelings, but another's, and beyond this longing for his forgiveness, there was growing up in her heart an intense, eager desire to stand by her husband's side in his work for the Saviour, who had held her back from utter ruin, who had given her grace to turn forever away from her sin and folly. She did not realize how utterly opposed to Christian work were all her habits of thought, her tastes, her associations, everything which had hitherto made up her life. Only to begin, to get a sure footing beside Perry and Tom and Una, and the battle would be won. Well had Una written, "Poor Eleanor Harrison, what struggles she will have to make!" Would she find it easier to put into her life that which she could not put into words? Would they, Perry and Tom, understand? Well, if they did not, and a thrill of joy animated her whole being as she thought, "There is one who knows, and he will give me the opportunities I seek." For one who had been for years a church member, Eleanor knew little about the Bible promises, but she knew that somewhere were such words as these: "Call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show thee great and mighty things which thou knowest not." and she resolved to ask Christ to show her what to do, where to begin. It was not like Eleanor Harrison to make much of the inner life at the expense of the outer. The heart cleansed, the sources of action purified, her desires and hopes took practical shape. To undo the wrongs, where this was possible, to build up anew upon the ruins of the irreparable, this was her hope and eager desire. These were the opportunities she sought. Even the smallest details of her course she would repair just as fast as she could. She had begun by requesting her mother to destroy those miserable letters, and now she waited to be led forward, waited, and yet it was not a restful waiting. She was too much accustomed to having things done without waiting. All her life she had been exacting and impatient of delay, and this was only one of the many forms of selfishness against which she must hereafter struggle. The spring came on early that year. The March days had only just gone by, with their blustering winds, and the weather was warm, the birds were singing, and the grass already began to take on a greenish hue, and Eleanor, unable to settle to anything indoors, went out to walk off her unrest. She was really and truly resting in the love of Christ. She felt that henceforth there was no doubt about her belonging to him, and now she wanted something to do for him. She was eager to witness for Christ. The lesson of patient waiting was hard for her to learn, but our Lord, who knoweth our frame, will not lay upon us heavier burdens than we can bear, neither will he give us harder lessons to learn than we can, by the aid of the Holy Spirit, conquer. And so it was that some little work was given to her to do that very day. As she passed through the dining room on her way out, she saw the new girl, which was the 7th since she sent away the faithful Molly, making bungling attempts at putting the room in order. "Oh dear," she said to herself, "what a distracting-looking room! How will Perry ever swallow a mouthful of dinner? I am sure I don't know what to do. I wonder why we have such wretched times getting servants that are efficient. There was Molly, she was a splendid housekeeper, I will own that, if she had but known her place. I don't think we have had a decent meal since she went, but I couldn't put up with her ways." Couldn't you, Eleanor Harrison? Well, who could put up with yours? It was just that thought that came to her, and she blushed to remember how she had sent away this old-time servant, who seemed necessary to the comfort of the household. Eleanor must have been strangely humbled when she could have said, even to herself, that perhaps she was somewhat to blame. The truth was, she knew actually nothing about housekeeping matters, and Perry sadly missed the comforts and the perfect order to which he had all his life been accustomed. Eleanor had not seen Molly for months, and had no knowledge of her place of residence. Was it chance that led her to stop at a street corner, undecided which way to go? "It looks pleasant down that way," she thought, "and I have never been there." So she turned into the narrow street, and had gone but a few steps when a voice broke upon her ears. "Were you coming to see me, Mrs. Harrison?" It was Molly, who rose from her stooping posture among the flower beds, and turned as if she would pass into the house to receive her visitor. Eleanor hesitated a moment before replying. Then she said, laughing, "I believe I was, though I confess I did not know it until this moment. But I won't go in. It is so sunny I would prefer to talk here." 15 minutes later Molly entered the house, and, speaking to a white-haired woman who was sewing in the cozy little front room, said, "Mother, I am going back to Mrs. Harrison's." "Is that a wise thing to do?" said the mother. "I don't know, but I promised Mrs. Harrison. I don't know what possessed me, but she had the words out of me before I knew it. Some way she seemed different. I can't tell how, but more like the dear mother. Maybe the spirit of that precious woman has some way entered into the young woman. I don't know what it is, but she is different." "When do you go?" asked the mother. "This afternoon," was the reply. "She said she wanted me to get tea. that it was a surprise that she was planning for Mr. Perry. She said she knew he had missed my ways about the house. "Well," said the mother, "you can do as you think best, but I should think you had had enough of life with that woman at the head." "I shall try it anyway," returned Molly with decision. As for Eleanor, quite elated over her work, she hastened home, thinking how she would enjoy Perry's surprise. She managed to detain him in the library until the tea bell sounded. They went down together. "I really believe that our newest experiment is going to be a success," said Perry. "This certainly looks like it, though it has taken her some time to show her skill." It was certainly an improvement upon the recent order of things. Fresh table linen, glittering silver and glistening glass, smoothly cut slices of bread evenly arranged upon the plate, pinky slices of cold meat without any ragged edges, everything in perfect order, the delicious aroma of properly made tea pervading the room. All this was accredited to the slatternly girl who had of late served up such nauseous dishes. Eleanor enjoyed Perry's surprise and evident pleasure, and he, noticing her manner, was puzzled by it. Indeed, he had more than once been puzzled within the past few days. Eleanor's moods were always varying, but of late, though not so varying, they had seemed new and strange. In response to his remark upon the change for the better in the table appointments, she only said she hoped it would last. But there was more than that in her face, and he waited to have it explain itself. Presently the trim and familiar Molly appeared with a plate of Perry's favorite muffins. "Ah," said the gentleman, "this explains it. Do you always take hold of the work when you make a visit?" he asked. "Oh, Molly is not visiting us," replied Mrs. Perry. "She has come to stay, for a time at least." "That's it. Well, it will seem like living again. But Eleanor," he continued as Molly left the room, "do you think it is a wise thing to do? Will Molly be more yielding than formerly, do you imagine?" There was a bright color on Eleanor's cheek, as she answered with an embarrassed laugh, "Well, Perry, I don't know as to that, but I thought that perhaps we had both learned something, and if we should each yield a little, the points of contact would soon wear smooth." "Well, arrange it as you choose, only I would not like to have the old story repeated," returned Perry, and Molly's reappearance put an end to the talk upon that subject. But to Perry, his wife was becoming more of a puzzle than ever. Could it be the proud, haughty Eleanor who talked of mutual concessions, and this, too, in connection with a servant? What had come over her? Even in her most gracious moods, she had never been like this. She had never been known to acknowledge herself in the wrong in the slightest degree. He grew anxious as he remembered that for days a change had been coming over her. Could she be ill? Was it physical weakness that had depressed her spirits? Or was she pining for a change? True, she did not seem sad to-night, only quiet. There was a gentleness that was almost sweetness in her tones, which was different from the smooth, even, society manner usual with her. Different, in that they sounded like heart tones. But Perry, blind and deaf, did not understand them. He thought her lonely and homesick, and read in the softened manner a sort of patient submission to the inevitable. And that evening, long after she slept, he paced up and down the library, his brain racked with varying plans. "Can I never make her happy?" he thought. "Will she not see that I am trying to atone for the wrong I have done? Unconscious though it was a wrong such as a woman like Eleanor would find it hard to overcome. Perhaps we ought to go away from here. She has never been happy here, and now there are so many unpleasant associations at every turn of the old place that, hard as it is, I am almost ready to turn my back upon it for her sake. God knows that I would make almost any sacrifice for her." It was true. The sacrifices which had been met at first from a sense of duty had become the willing offerings of a loving heart. It was not the worshipping love of youth, nor yet a hoping, trusting, requited love, but a tender, pitying love that would draw its object within the circling love of God. With even such a love, deep, earnest, and self-sacrificing, Eleanor Harrison might well have called herself blessed. It was with this longing for the power to make her happy that he planned and prayed and fought, with the temptation to lie down in despair, for there were times even yet when answer to his prayers seemed afar off, when he felt that he could scarcely endure the waiting, as if they must have help for the life that they were leading. And this was not more upon his own account than upon hers, for he knew that his wife was not happy, that he had utterly failed in his efforts to help her to bear the sorrow which had come upon her as the result of the fearful mistake into which they had fallen. He would take his wife and go away. It would be better for all. Una was recovering, and yet he had not seen her. Not that he dreaded the interview upon his own account. He felt that the love which he had been fighting against was conquered. He knew now, out of his own experience, that the grace of God is sufficient even for the retrieving of such mistakes. He did not fear to meet her. She would always be to him as a dear sister. But he was not sure of her state of mind. She was weak and still confined to the house. But, sooner or later, he knew that they must meet. And, while he believed there would not be the slightest cause for it, he feared that if they were to keep up the old habits of intimacy, Eleanor's hatred and jealousy would again be aroused, and it would seem very awkward not to meet on friendly terms, the two families had so long been united in close intimacy. It would be hard to leave his people, for he had grown to think of the interests of the village people as his own. But that might be managed. The school, the lunchrooms, and the other enterprises had become so well established that they might be left to the care of someone else. "Duties never conflict," he said, "and it seems to be my evident duty to try to make my wife happy." And with this conclusion he planned an extensive summer tour, which he laid before his wife the next morning. She listened until he ended by saying, "Now, Eleanor, if we carry out this program, either as a whole or with modifications, you will want a few days in the city soon." She replied by asking, "Perry, is it on my account that you have planned this?" Always truthful, Perry answered, "I certainly had my wife's pleasure in view, though I expect to enjoy the trip myself." "But you would not go except for me," she persisted. "I should not go except with you," he replied, laughing. "That is dodging the question. But I think I understand you, Perry Harrison," she said, laughing too. Then soberly, "Don't think I would drag you away on such a chase as this. We will stay at home this summer, except for a few weeks, perhaps, if we can make up a pleasant party for the mountains. I know you will gain strength faster than you will if you go on this journey, and besides, how can you leave your work here?" "I thought you would like it," Perry said. He was too much surprised to say much, and a little grieved that the scheme which he had at the expense of his own inclination laid before her should not meet with her favor, for he could not yet realize that she was making a sacrifice for him. "I would like it," she replied, "only well, Perry, need we decide at once?" "Certainly not. Take your time." And Perry, looking into the face that met his gaze so frankly, thought how very fair was this woman, whose life was linked with his own, and there rose before him a vision of what their life might yet become. It seems strange sometimes how opportunities come to us when we really seek them. That afternoon, as they were at tea, a note was left for Perry, which seemed to disturb him. "Is it anything serious, Perry?" asked Eleanor. "You look troubled." "Not very, only Miss Wilbur says she will not be able to meet her class this evening at the hall, and I don't quite know where to look for a substitute." There were a few minutes' silence, then Eleanor spoke. In these few moments there had been a fierce conflict going on in her heart. All the instincts of her nature revolted at the thought of coming in contact with the class of people whom she fancied were accustomed to meet in that hall. And then she had so opposed the whole scheme. Her pride whispered to her not to follow out her impulse, that it would be too humiliating. But her new resolves thus put to the test triumphed, and she said, hesitatingly, "Perry, could I do it?" The stupid man looked puzzled, and said, "Do what, Eleanor?" "Why, teach that class." "Why, would you?" "If I could, if you think I would do for once. I thought it would save you trouble, perhaps." "Thank you." That was all he said, but the look and tone made it mean much. Still Perry was puzzled. Would these two ever understand each other? End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of From Different Standpoints by Pansy and Faye Huntington. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Extract from Eunice's Journal. May 4, 18 blank. How the days go by! Actually, it is a year today since that spring morning when Tom Haddington came up from New York all unexpectedly, because he had been here so short a time before, and, well, what a fool I was! During all this year I haven't written in my journal. I have been too busy and too settled. I don't believe people write in journals unless they are unsettled and unhappy. I'm not sure I believe in journals. At least, I don't believe in mine. I never read a sillier, and in some respects a wickeder book. I mean to burn mine, or lock it up in the largest and deepest trunk I can get to put in my new garret. The garret is immense, Tom says. I have been running through it this evening, the journal, not the garret, trying to determine whether there is any record in it that I want to keep, if there is anything my descendants might like to read. If there isn't, what was the use of my writing it? Now, possibly, there will be people living 100 years hence who might enjoy reading it simply because my hand wrote it. But the question is, would I enjoy having them? There are some tender words about that dear saint, Mother Harrison. Those might be helpful to young Christian lives. There are some strong words of my dear father's that might be helpful to anybody. But the mass of it is rubbish. My cheeks burn with shame while I read it. Such unutterable stuff about Perry Harrison! A good deal of it before he was married, and some, infinitely worse, afterward. Could I bear to have any strong, pure-hearted girl, my grandchild, say, or Perry's great-grandson, read that terrible revelation of folly and sin? And yet, wouldn't my mistakes be helpful to them, possibly? Don't people often see things with blinded eyes, when, if they would look at another life that has been lived, and see the same lines of trouble made smooth, and crookedness made straight, by the infinite love and infinite patience of a friend who never makes mistakes and never changes, and never dies, wouldn't it be helpful? At least I shall not burn my journal to-night. But it doesn't seem to me that I can let Tom see it ever. It is too silly, where it is not too wicked. The idea of my ever fancying that I ought to have married Perry Harrison, especially after he was married! I seem for a time to have ignored that important fact. But, even before that, how I would have fancied such a thing seems incredible to me. Perry is a dear, good friend. A better brother it wouldn't be possible to have. Tom says he is the grandest Christian man, in some respects, that he ever knew. But, well, he isn't in the least like Tom, and I know that Tom Haddington is the only man on earth whom it would be possible for me to marry. How glad I am that Perry has never known the folly and the sin of which I have been guilty. Being true and brave and strong-hearted himself, it has never occurred to him that I could be otherwise. He need never be humiliated by knowing it. Yet I am glad that Tom knows all about it, and equally glad that I did not have to tell him. He says he thinks he has known all about me that could be told by human being, and a great deal that couldn't be told. Ever since he first knew me, and all the time that I was being a blind simpleton, he was grand and patient. I thank God for such a friend. How wonderfully have I been led! What a horrible mesh of tangles would I have made of the web of life, could I but have had the weaving it! And yet there was a time when I deemed myself wise enough to have planned it all, and done much better work than was done for me. Well, the infinite patience of God is beyond conception to one who has not tried it to the utmost, as surely I have done. Do you know, Journal, you are to bid good-bye to Eunice Taylor this very night? Surely you must have had enough of me. At least, I have. To-morrow before this time I will be Eunice Haddington. It is a remarkably pretty name. Eleanor has pleased herself by writing it in a delicate running hand on some of my handkerchiefs. Eleanor has done everything for me. Who could have supposed that the day would come when I should be proud to own her for a sister? There is change for you. Not all in myself, either. Who would recognize in her the Eleanor Harrison who came a bride to the old homestead? How fast the Lord can work when he takes a soul in hand to transform it to suit his pattern. Eleanor is an intense anything. So of course her intensity shows in the new life as it did in the old. There is Tom. I hear his step in the hall. He is coming to see me about trunks, and really they are not half packed. Good night, old friend, and good-bye. I don't believe I shall ever feel like looking at you again. Extract from Perry's Journal. May 4, 18 —. God bless my sister Una. How beautiful is the life that is opening before her. What an idiot I was not to see long before how the tide was drifting. The Lord knew. If, as a Christian, I am more thankful for one blessing than another, next to the gift of a Redeemer, it is the guiding, overruling hand of God that fills me with joy. There is no tried, tempted soul, however fierce the waves of temptation or pain may roll over him, but may, if he will, rest quietly covered by the shielding hand. God is faithful, who will not suffer one to be tempted above what he is able to bear, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that we may be able to bear it. That is true, true. Let me set my seal to the absolute certainty of help from the blessed Lord in all our needs and sorrows and terrors. He more than keeps his promise. He gives more than simply grace to endure. He sets one on the heights of peace. Let me record my gratitude here for the way in which I have been led. Looking back, I can see that the way was a wise one, that his tender mercies were all around me, that he had in view my present as well as my future in the way in which I have been led. I feel very grateful for the help this journal has been to me. I shall keep it for a future help. Looking over it humbles and subdues me, and at the same time helps and rests. There are records of defeat, it is true, but, blessed be his name, there are also records of victories. There are pages that I will need some day to paste together, in order that by no mistake shall human eye behold them. And there are pages that might possibly help some struggling soul, at least the mute companionship and enduring patience of the book has helped me, and I shall keep it as a friend. Eleanor and I are going over this evening to say good-bye to Una Taylor. She will be Mrs. Tom Haddington to-morrow. I record with gratitude the fact that I can say, with clear voice and sincere heart, thank God for that. They are suited to each other. I think, aside from their two selves, no one sees this more plainly than Eleanor does. What gracious things the Lord can do for a soul when he abides within! My Eleanor grows. Underneath her are the everlasting arms. There are things that she thinks I do not know. I mean she shall continue to think so. It is best that she should, for the present at least. One of these days, when we have both gotten so near to heaven as to be able to smile together over past human follies, we will talk it over perhaps, and make all things plain to each other. Indeed, it may not be until we both have entered heaven, and then I do not know but it may all have sunken so utterly into nothingness as to be not worth talking of, for then we shall realize that nothing but love remains. Love for Christ first, and next the love that he sanctions and blesses, and no other. One other thanksgiving let me record before we say good-bye to Una. My Savior, my Helper, my Healer, I thank thee that thou didst give me Eleanor Haddington for my wife, and didst teach me to cleave unto her until death do part us, and didst give me the hope and confidence that death itself cannot part us, that the bond between us need never be broken. May we, as we each day draw sensibly nearer to each other, be drawn nearer to thee until ourselves should be utterly lost in thee. Amen. It is the experience of human beings generally that they so promptly become accustomed to a new order of things as to forget in a few weeks that any other condition of affairs ever existed. At least if they do not forget, they cease to comment, even to think of it, except at rare intervals when some special occasion forces the contrast on their attention. At the Harrison homestead, the year of peace that had followed the sadly tossed and disappointing life which had been lived there, had so calmed the inmates that, as I say, except on special occasions they had already ceased to think of that other and trying time. There had been several weeks of bewilderment to Perry, when, in the stupidity of his heart, he struggled to plan new things and new scenes for his wife, and she gently refused to be planned for, and at last, bent on discovering what it was she wanted, and how they could better their life, he prisoned her in his study one evening, and tenderly, patiently, persistently questioned, until in a burst of tears his haughty Eleanor had melted before him, and told the story of her new hopes and plans and aims, and begged his help and his patience. And he, looking down upon her in amazed bewilderment for a few moments, had suddenly exclaimed, with a ring to his voice and an intensity of feeling that she had not expected, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name." Since which time that tune, in some of its changes, had rung in his heart, and yet they rapidly, after the manner of mortals, settled into the new order of things. It was amazing, when one looked back, to see how soon it became the most natural and matter-of-course thing in the world for Mr. and Mrs. Harrison to go together to the evening school, to arrange together some new plans for the reading room, to call together on certain ones about whom Perry had been anxious. Nay, according to her eager, restless nature, she went ahead of him. She brought all her fascinations to bear on the factory boys and girls. It became an ordinary occurrence to Perry to come with a perplexed face and say, "Eleanor, what shall we do with Mamie Phillips? I am worried about her." Or, "Eleanor, Will Bates is in trouble. I don't quite understand the circumstances. Can we get at them, do you think?" And then would follow a consultation, during which Perry's brow would clear, and his voice would have a relieved ring as he said, "That's a capital idea. Oh, Eleanor, what a helper you are!" It took, too, but a short time to become accustomed to the fact that a remarkable change had come to the feelings with which his wife and Una viewed each other. During Una's remaining days of invalidism, Eleanor was daily at the little house across the way, and on the first evening when she asked Perry to accompany her, and he saw Una for the first time since her illness, he felt the change that had come to both. Since that time the old habits of running back and forth from the Taylor house to the Harrison house had been resumed, only in these days it was Una who consulted Eleanor, or Eleanor who consulted Una. The long and frequent consultations that had been the habit of years between Una and himself were over. The habit had been broken in upon by illness, and was never resumed. It was very rarely indeed that he saw her alone now. It was not that either shunned the other, but that both were so full of their plans and their work began to lie so much apart, that the need for consultation seemed to be gone. Una did not go into the school again. The village people thought she was not well enough, and Eleanor had taken her class. But Una knew that it was not worth while to resume a routine which must so soon be broken in upon. They stood on the steps one day, chattering, Una and Eleanor and Perry. Una had her hat in her hand and was just going. "Oh, Una," Eleanor said, "wait a minute, please. I want to get that list I made out for you. The directions where to find the places are all written out. You can't mistake. I've given you ever so many errands to do, but I couldn't help it." "She is going into town to-morrow," she explained, in answer to her husband's inquiring look, "and I want some things for the class. I can't go myself because those 2 girls of yours are coming this afternoon to learn leaf stitch." Then she vanished. "Una, do you remember that I once told you that you two could be great helps to each other?" Perry asked as they waited. "And I was skeptical," answered Una, smiling. "I was a simpleton in those days, and Eleanor was not what she is now. We are both changed, and life has changed." "I know," answered Perry, gravely. Then, smiling, "Besides, Eleanor tells me she asked you to be her sister, and I judge that you consented to it." A vivid blush overspread Una's face, and she looked down in utter confusion. "I did not mean," continued the wicked Perry, "that you depended solely on her asking. I assure you I think you have ample reason to consider yourself heartily invited to the relationship." Then his tone changed again. "God bless you, my sister. I thank God for you. I am glad that you are to be, more truly than ever, my sister. And I thank God that Tom Haddington is my brother." There was peculiar emphasis thrown into that last sentence, as if he desired to call her attention to the event that had made Tom Haddington his brother, and then he instantly spoke of something else. It was all the talk that these two, who recognized that they had been fools, and had been saved from shipwreck by unseen hands, allowed themselves to have about their past. Neither did Una and Eleanor refer often to that passage in their history when they had come so near to each other as to lay bare their hearts for each other's gaze. They were neither of them women to whom this was an easy task, and such do not frequently tear open old wounds. Once Eleanor referred to it. It was the evening before the wedding, and they were together in Una's room, giving last touches to the preparations. A little silence had fallen between them, broken at last by Eleanor's question, "Una, did Tom tell you about Mr. Romaine?" "Yes," Una answered, and then hesitating, as one who did not know what next to say. Presently she added, "It did not surprise me. I wonder that he has not gone before. I think he is just fitted for mission work, only one would have thought that he would have found enough to do in this country." To this Eleanor made no answer. She was evidently not in a mood to discuss the respective claims of home and foreign missions. At last she said, "I am not sure, Una, that I can make clear to you what this is to me. You remember what I told you once, and how you answered me? Well, your words were true. There is help with God. His mercy and his forgiveness and his patience are infinite. I have tried them all. Sometimes it seems to me I tried them to their utmost limit. He has given me not only pardon, but peace and rest. And yet, Una, there is a pain that it seems to me even God cannot take away. I have wrecked a human life. I mean so far as earthly happiness is concerned. Isn't it strange? While I have found a friend, who is every hour of my life dearer to me, I, who alone am to blame, have been received into the fullness of earthly happiness, and he, who was the victim only, not in any sense the sinner, is the sufferer." "Are you sure?" asked Una, turning toward her with tender, pitying eyes. "Can there be any real suffering where a soul is so entirely at peace with God as his is, and where one is so utterly given up to God's work as he is? I suspect he has a higher happiness than you or I know anything about. And you, who are bearing the sting of remorse, are the punished one after all." "That is true," said Eleanor. "But, Una, I tell you that even remorse, heavy though it is sometimes, cannot shut me out from the thought that I have my husband, and that he is to me what, in my selfishness and fierceness, I did not suppose he could ever be. Why should such happiness have been given to me?" "It is the seal of the royal way in which the King forgives," Una answered, her face shining with joy. "When you come to speak of one's deserts, Eleanor, you get on very low ground. You make me think of what I have been, and what the forgiving God has given me." "Yes," Eleanor said, thoughtfully, "it is all of grace. But, Una, there is a very solemn side to it. Even God cannot take away the results that follow from our sins. Cannot always do it, I mean. The scars remain. I shall always have to think of a scarred life that I have made." "And yet, my dear sister, you are bound also to remember that his leader is bound in honor to make even the scars into good for him." "Thank you," Eleanor said. And, though there were tears in her eyes, she smiled. There were thoughts in her heart that she left unsaid. She could not bring herself to say to this almost bride that there lay at times a heavy fear upon her that she had lost her husband's love. He was tenderness itself, and yet could he forget or forgive or absolutely trust her? And Una, looking at the tearful yet shining eyes, felt sad for her, felt almost certain that the new life had opened too late for her to hold her husband's love, and yet felt that not for the world would she have hinted such a thing to the struggling, repentant woman. So yet even these people did not by any means understand each other, and looked at their lives from their different standpoints, and thought their thoughts and believed that every side was plain to them, and that only the others were in mist. How well it was for them each that their lives lay in hands that understood and saw with clear vision to the end, or to the eternities, for to lives there is no end. Sometimes the all-seeing eye and the ever-tender heart puts it into human hearts to speak the right words at the right time. It was the morning of the wedding. Indeed, the wedding had been. The solemn words spoken so many times had sounded again, and Una Taylor, who had told her journal so solemnly long before that certain joys were not for her, had departed with a face in which shone the fullness of human joy and rest. Those left behind were beginning to feel that reaction which is sure to follow an excitement of any sort, and perhaps specially the excitement of a wedding. Eleanor Harrison went about the little parlor at the Taylors', leaving little touches here and there that lessened the confusion and the dreariness, doing those things that the nearest friend stops to do when a daughter of the house has gone out from it. There was a sort of half-sad, half-wistful expression on her face when her eye sought her husband's, which moved him strangely, and which led him by an impulse, the source of which he did not understand, to bend toward her a moment when they were alone at the farther end of the room, and say, "Do you want me to quote a sentence that I wrote in my diary last evening?" "Yes," she said, smiling. "That is, if it was a good sentence, one that will help right the bewilderment of things." "I don't know as to that, but I wrote this sentence from a full heart. I thank God that Eleanor Haddington is my wife." He had a flash then from Eleanor Harrison's eyes such as he had never seen before. "It helps," she said simply, but the tone and the look that accompanied them made his heart beat, and each of these two foolish ones felt that their true bridal had just commenced. Well, lives do not stop being lived. unless death comes in and snaps the thread. And these lives are being lived, all of them, today. All this happened not long ago, and yet many things have happened since that might be told. But stories have to stop. They cannot wind up, for there are the lives going on, something being said and done every day, every hour, that one would like to chronicle. And yet one mustn't. Who would read a story that went on, just like a life? It is as much as people can do to live their lives. So as there is no place in which to round and smooth this story into finishing, it must just stop. The End. End of chapter 28. End of From Different Standpoints by Pansy and Faye Huntington. Recorded by TriciaG, Bowmanville, Ontario. Thanks for listening.